Now, big breaking news coming in at this hour. The US-India interim trade deal, a big joint statement has now been released by both sides. United States has cut tariffs on India from 50% to now 18%. The US-India now agree on an interim trade framework. This comes after both US President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Modi reached and sealed a historic trade deal. India to cut tariffs on all US industrial goods, textiles, leather, chemicals to get US tariff relief. US to remove tariffs on pharma, gems, aircraft parts. India to also get preferential access for auto parts. India is also going to address US concerns on non-tariff barriers. These are the big headlines that we're getting from this on this hour. Breaking news with both India and the United States finally releasing a joint statement on that historic trade deal that was reached between the two countries earlier this week. Joining us on the broadcast, we now have Priyanka Deo, our correspondent from the United States. Priyanka Deo, right, we have Priyanka as well as our other correspondents, Aditya Raj Kaul as well as Vishnu Som joining us at this hour to help us decode this big joint statement that has now been released by both the United States and India. Aditya, I'd first like to go to you. Aditya, help us decode some of the key highlights of this joint statement.
Well, it's a huge, success for both United States and India. A year into the negotiations of the trade deal, finally, we are breaking this first on NDTV. Just about a couple of hours ago, the White House and the India's Commerce and Industry Ministry have released a joint statement. This was under works. This was expected. And this is a joint statement, but the negotiations are still underway and the final deal could be finalized in the month of March. Now, there are 12 significant points in this. One, of course, that the framework on the trade deal has been finalized. The US will remove duties on pharma, on gems. That is quite significant for India. And of course, the big talking point which Trump had himself announced, that the overall tariffs of 50% have been reduced to 18%. But just minutes before the entire joint statement was announced between India and US, there came an executive order, and that was about the Russian oil. Now remember, Donald Trump administration has been talking about in detail about India's purchase of the Russian oil, and that needs to go completely. He had said that India will stop buying the Russian oil. Well, we haven't heard that from India. India's Ministry of External Affairs spokesperson had said that India will continue to trade with Russia. But in this particular executive order, the 25% additional tariff has been completely, gone away. And it says that if India continues, probably in future, to do trade with Russia, then this 25% tariff will come again. But for now, this is going away, and this is based on the assurance from the Indian government that it will buy American oil and at the same time indulge in a defense cooperation over the next 10 years. So that is quite significant. But textiles, leathers, chemicals, duties go away, and that is a big win-win for India. The interim trade agreement has been agreed upon. That's a quite significant achievement. There are some finer blueprints that are still, emerging. Only 12 basic points on this have been released on agriculture as well. So this is at this moment a win-win situation for both Modi and Trump, that they will go out, in public in detail over the next few days. But as of now, the joint statement has been released, and additionally, executive orders have also been given on the Russian oil.
All right. Well, I'd just like to thank all of you for joining us early this morning. Raymond Vickery with us as well. My colleague Priyanka joins Aditya and me. I think a simple summary of what India can expect out of this deal is something which the Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal has just sort of tweeted out a little while back. I'm going to go through those points before we start looking at it. Now, there's also a joint statement which, as Aditya was mentioning, is out. It's an Indo-US joint statement. It's not a simple read. It's a complicated one. There are lots of conditions attached to each and every point. But I think what we now know is the entire scope of what India and the United States are looking for. Separately, what Aditya was referring to is on the US expectation that India would completely sever the import of oil from Russia. Now, in terms of what India can expect, here's what Piyush Goyal says. Under the leadership of the Prime Minister, India has reached a framework for an interim agreement with the US. This will open a $30 trillion market for Indian exporters, especially MSMEs, right? Those are small businesses, farmers and fishermen. The increase in exports will create lakhs of new job opportunities for women and for youth. As part of this framework, the US will slash reciprocal tariffs on Indian goods to 18%, provide a huge market opportunity in key areas such as textiles and apparel, leather and footwear, plastic and rubber products, organic chemicals, home decor, artisanal products, and select machinery in the world's largest economy. So that's how India stands to gain from this. Additionally, tariffs will go down to zero on a wide range of goods, including generic pharmaceuticals, gems and diamonds, and aircraft parts, thereby further enhancing India's export competitiveness and Make in India. India will also get exemptions under Section 232 on aircraft parts, tariff rate quotas on auto parts, and negotiated outcomes on generic pharmaceuticals, leading to tangible export gains in these sectors. At the same time, the agreement reflects India's commitment to safeguarding farmers' interests and sustaining rural livelihoods by completely protecting, and I think this is a very key part, which people would really want details of, because this is what the opposition was concerned about. What the government says is the agreement reflects India's commitment to safeguarding farmers' interests and sustaining rural livelihoods by completely protecting sensitive agricultural and dairy products, including maize, wheat, rice, soya, poultry, milk, cheese, ethanol, tobacco, and certain vegetables and meat. This is absolutely critical because the real worry in these areas was that the US could potentially flood Indian markets with cheap, for example, milk or wheat or maize, and small Indian farmers could be impacted. So they've been protected. Priyanka, to you first. Firstly, on the scope of the deal, is this truly the mega deal that both sides had hoped for? Or is this, in your reading, something that's still in the works despite the joint statement?
The interim trade framework that's just been announced, it represents definitely a notable recalibration of a relationship between the US and India that has seen growing friction in recent years. I won't go into the details because you went into them so well, but India's commitments here are also equally broad in this interim deal. So New Delhi has also agreed to cut tariffs across all US industrial goods, expand access for American agricultural and food products. We'll have to see what that looks like, and also begin addressing non-tariff barriers that have long been a point of contention, particularly in things like medical devices, ICT imports, regulatory standards. So to put the scale in context, US-India trade in goods and services is already close to $200 billion annually, making this tariff reset economically significant even before a final and full agreement is finalized. So what we can see and what it means to India and the United States near term is lower US tariffs, will improve price competitiveness for Indian exports. Medium term is pressure to reform non-tariff barriers. So strategically, India actually strengthens its role as a trusted supply chain partner. Now, for the United States, near term, what United States can expect from this deal is expanded market access for US industrial goods and agriculture in India, areas where tariff and regulatory barriers were high for years, and large predictable demand from India, which includes energy, which includes aircraft and technology inputs. So I wouldn't call it a mega deal, but it definitely is significant, and we're looking forward to see what the final deal is.
Raymond Vickery, the United States Trade Representative has just tweeted out details as well, and they seem to. And this is what I was talking about reflects perhaps an Indian standpoint, but for the U.S., from tree nuts and dried distillers grain to red sorghum and fresh and processed fruit, The US-India trade agreement will provide new market access for American products. President Trump is expanding American farmers and producers' access to one of the largest economies in the world. It eliminates or lowers tariffs for all US industrial goods and a wide array of agricultural products. There will be a purchase of over 500 billion of US products. And so that's going to be done within a finite period of time as well. Your first reading of the scope of this agreement, Raymond Vickery.
Well, thanks very much for allowing me to comment on this. You know, I have long been an advocate for economic engagement as key to a partnership between these two greatest and largest democracies in the world. Unfortunately, it seems to me, while this is helpful in ameliorating the damage which has been done to the relationship by putting on tariffs, by having $100,000 H-1B visa requirement, about claiming credit for Pakistan in regard to hostilities. That damage, it seems to me, is ameliorated, if not completely stopped, by what is going on here. It does seem to me that this is not a deal as such. This is really a framework for a deal. The 18% tariff, I think, has to be seen in context that the tariff was 2.5% before this was announced. So it's really gone to 18%. I think you can say that there are some things which are in India's favor here in terms of exempting pharmaceuticals and various products. So India is doing well in terms of negotiating for market access in view of a problem which was created by President Trump in the first place. I note that there's very little said, there's nothing said in the joint statement about stopping purchases of oil. There is a separate executive order which is unclear as to what India really has said that they're due in regard to Russian oil. Nevertheless, it is encouraging that there is at least a talking and a joint desire expressed for peace in Ukraine and stopping the Russian invasion. As to the $500 billion purchase, you note that it's really aspirational over 5 years. There's no absolute commitment to do it. So I think it's welcome to have some framework, but the deal as announced by President Trump earlier is not this. I mean, this is it might turn out to be this in the longer run. And I think India is doing a great job in keeping a cool head and being very positive about one of the most important relationships, I would argue the most important relationships among great democracies in the world. But there's many a slip.
Can you just hold on for half a second, because I've got a little bit of detail on that $500 billion amount. And it's, I've just sort of going through the fine print. Now, what the White House statement says, this is the joint statement, is that India intends to purchase $500 billion of US energy products, aircraft and aircraft parts, precious metals, technology products, and coking coal over the next 5 years. India and the US will significantly increase trade in technology products, including graphics processing units. So that's where semiconductors are absolutely key, and other goods used in data centers, and expand joint technology cooperation. So, Priyanka, 500 billion, which we all felt, where is this going to actually come from? They've identified the areas where it will. Your thoughts on the 500 billion part first, before we go through some other areas?
I mean, I would say that the US-India interim trade framework, that's a good word, that's a good way to put it, is kind of best understood as a directional signal, not really a finalized or binding agreement. Figures cited publicly, like the $500 billion in potential Indian purchases from the US over 5 years, it should be understood as, at this point, illustrative, long-range estimates, not firm procurement commitments. And such numbers are commonly used to indicate scale and also intent, rather than guaranteed outcomes, and depend on market conditions, on pricing, regulatory follow-through. So from a policy standpoint, the framework aims to reduce friction overall, to provide, I would say, predictability for businesses, and also just to keep negotiations moving, focus less on tariffs, focus more on what we're going to do together, while more complex issues are addressed.
You know, Aditya, the entire point on the import of oil from Russia. Now, a couple of points I think we can perhaps look at. Number one, India was already scaling down the purchase of Russian oil because the premise of India's oil imports from Russia was that it had to be at a rate that worked for India. At this juncture, as a result of additional tariffs from the United States on Russian firms, for example, Rosneft and others, it was increasingly becoming unviable. And therefore, India moving potentially to the United States, Venezuela, et cetera, and that's been announced in the recent past, was perhaps a natural thing to do. So it's, from an economic standpoint, some would argue that there's nothing necessarily wrong with India cutting down on Russian oil imports presently. It was not viable anymore for reasons beyond our control. That's one way of looking at it. Would you agree, Aditya?
That's right. Vishnu, you put it out there that over the last few months, India was trying to diversify. And this was just from the pricing point of view. What was beneficial for the Indian masses, the Indian consumers, was being looked into. India did get the Venezuelan oil earlier. But if the Russian oil is completely cut down, will Venezuelan oil be able to do it? The answer is no. But yes, India will be diversifying. It could be the American oil, it could be the Venezuelan oil. But we did put this question to the India's Ministry of External Affairs spokesperson just a couple of days ago. And he said that India will continue to do whatever trade it does with Russia. So there's no complete cut down that India has announced yet. There's a different kind of a messaging that is coming out of White House. In fact, as Mr. Vikri also pointed out, in the framework, in the joint statement that has been announced, there's nothing mentioned in regard to the Russian oil apart from the executive order that Trump has signed just a couple of hours ago, where he says that there's an assurance that has come in from the government of India that India will diversify, India will get American oil, Venezuelan oil, and also a defense framework over the next 10 years. There's a 500 billion business proposition also on purchase and defense, etc., of the American products. In fact, I would like to get Mr. Vikri on this point as well, that how significant was the assurance on the Russian oil significant for this joint statement and the trade deal that we'll see in March to come out? And also, just a couple of weeks ago, we saw the India-EU sign an FTA. Do you think that that was also a clincher in many ways, which, pushed this, advanced this a little? Because we had, for instance, Carl Bildt, the former Prime Minister of Sweden, commenting very recently and saying that it was the India-EU deal that finally led to the India-US trade deal.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think that the engagement that India has shown with the EU, not to mention the other deals with UK and EFTA, which is Norway, Switzerland, Luxembourg, have all had an impact. I think that the real significance in regard to Russian oil is that India has moved in the direction of trying to help to rein in the Russian invasion of Ukraine as the worst violation of the UN Charter since it was put into effect some 80 years ago. But it is a long way from what President Trump has said. He said earlier in his True Social statement that India had just said they weren't going to buy, that India's not going to buy any more Russian oil. Well, that doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, it's left out of the joint statement, and the executive order is not completely clear on that point. So the good news is, yes, I think that India is a great power internationally, and that means that great powers have interest in peace and prosperity throughout the world, including what happens between Russia and Ukraine. As my recollection is, that was not the position of India. The Minister of External Affairs, for example, saying that Europe had to get over the idea that Europe's problems were the world's problems. In fact, problems in Russia, Ukraine are India's problems as well. So that's the very good news. The not so good news is President Trump jumping the gun and saying that India is just going to stop all its oil buying from Russia. That does not appear to be in the cards, and it shows the limits of using tariffs, it seems to me, to try to accomplish what should be accomplished by having a strategy, by having partners, by having principles in order to be able to come up with a unified approach, or at least a coordinated approach on these areas. But the basic point you made in terms of the EU agreement having an impact on the U.S. and the U.S.-India deal is absolutely right, and it's a movement in the right direction. India being engaged with great democracies in Western Europe, as well as the United States, and I would argue when you get to the Quad with Japan, Australia, and so forth, that's all very positive. And we just have to work our way through what is really, to me, a chaotic approach to U.S.-India relations.
All right, let me get in Priyanka there also at this stage.
On the import of oil, in that executive order by the White House, I'm just going to read it out and analyze it a little bit more. The US president says, I've received additional information and recommendations from senior officials regarding India's efforts to address the national emergency described in Executive Order 14066. That's, the broader context in which this is being placed. It's the Russia-Ukraine war. Specifically, India has committed to stop directly or indirectly importing Russian Federation oil, has represented that it will purchase US energy products from the US, and has recently committed to a framework with the US to expand defense cooperation over the next 10 years. Now, again, Aditya, one other way of looking at this, right, is that there is a real hope that the Russia-Ukraine war will end. It cannot go on indefinitely. There is a very active peace process which is going on. There is every expectation that once that the war ends, India can resume, potentially, if it is in our economic interests, the import of Russian oil. So this is being done now, right? Potentially. And that's what the White House says. We will clarify from New Delhi as well. But as you also mentioned, it has already been scaled down considerably. But I personally believe that this should not be seen as a showstopper or a huge question mark. I believe it's a step that's being done now. It meets economic interests of India. And in the future, if the war ends, it could be reversed. Those are my thoughts. Aditya and Priyanka, Aditya first.
Well, that's right, Vishnu. Firstly, on trade front, India has been trying to diversify. We've seen over the last few years, at least 9 FTAs been signed. In the last 10 months alone, there have been 5 FTAs with UK beginning in July last year, and then the mother of all deals, India and EU, coming up, and finally now the US and India joint statement on the trade deal that will be finalized most likely by March. But you were right that there are two significant aspects here. The win for India diplomatically is that in the joint statement, both sides have agreed not to mention Russian oil or any kind of decisions or assurances on that front. The executive order does say that the Russian oil assurance has come from India, but that's not clearly binding on India. The executive order has been signed by the US president and is for the enforcement and regulations of their own country. At the same time, there's a caveat. The caveat there is that if India indulges in purchase of oil or trade in future, then there will be this 25% reciprocal tariff or additional tariff that will be imposed again. We'll have to see if India walks a tightrope or again speaks about the strategic autonomy part, or India has come out in a win-win diplomacy when it comes to having India-EU trade deal, having the India-US trade deal, and maintaining strong historic ties with Moscow as well. I would like to get Priyanka also on this strategic autonomy part, because over the last 4 years, ever since the Russia-Ukraine war, Priyanka, India has spoken in detail about strategic autonomy. India has also said that our energy sourcing is completely based on pricing point of view and what benefits the consumer and a common Indian at the end of the day. Do you think after this, the kind of framework or the joint statement that has come out, do you think it is a win-win for our diplomacy also, because our strategic autonomy point stands there? We haven't announced any kind of complete ban or stoppage of trade and oil with Russia, but at the same time, we have a deal on a platter here with US.
What we're seeing from Washington, Aditya, that's a great question. We're seeing a clearer use of kind of trade tools to shape energy behavior during the Russia-Ukraine war that is still ongoing. So the executive order targets the idea of secondary consequences, meaning the focus isn't on only on direct US imports, which are already restricted, but also on the wider ecosystem that enables Russian oil sales. And this includes things like purchasing, shipping, insurance, financing. So the practical effect is to essentially raise the commercial and the compliance risk for countries and companies that continue to buy or facilitate Russian oil trade. So for partners like India, the immediate issue is energy affordability versus exposure to policy risk. India has relied on discounted Russian crude, but secondary pressure changes the long-term calculus here. It encourages the diversification and also creates incentives to shift more volume towards other suppliers over time, depending on market pricing and how enforcement evolves. So now the Trump administration is kind of positioning these measures as leverage towards negotiations with India, but the timeline for any ceasefire or settlement still remains uncertain with Russia, Ukraine, and ultimately depends on decisions by the parties to the war and the structure of any talks. So the bigger signal is this: energy trade, tariffs, foreign policy are now being treated as one connected policy package with incentives on one side, constraints on the other. So this is about changing incentives and raising costs. It is not by itself a guarantee of the outcome. So we're just going to have to see what happens with Russia and Ukraine. I feel that that is going to determine what India is going to do next. And India has already made it clear that they are going to do what is best for their economic interest.
I think what Aditya was also mentioning is that one part, which is, what if India, goes ahead and restarts importing Russian oil in the interim period? And the statement from the White House says that there is a monitoring process in place with which the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary of Commerce, etc., they shall recommend whether and to what extent I should take additional action as to India, including whether I should reimpose the additional ad valorem rate of duty of 25% on imports of articles of India. So this has been spelled out as well in case there is a resumption of Indian oil imports.